Welcome to the AFGHANEYE YouTube channel. If this is your first visit, make sure to subscribe and press the notification bell so that you won't miss any of our new videos. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the second AFGHANEYE live with our guest Emran Feroz. Just to see if everything is working well. Can you guys hear us? Is the audio good? Emran, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay.
After a long time again.
Yes. Walid, assalamu alaikum. How you been doing?
Wa alaikum assalam. Alhamdulillah. I'm doing well. It's just Ramadan, so I'm sure everyone here is basically feeling the same way on this Sunday.
Okay. Let's see. I need to just quickly check the audio.
After a long time again.
Yes. Yeah, okay, the audio is working. JZ says salam everyone. Yes, okay. So we have one person confirming that the audio is good. We'll just wait until the rest of our viewers will come. Just before we start, Imran, how much time do you have?
We can do it 2 hours, 90 minutes, whatever.
So,
yeah. I
okay,
think maximum
guys,
2 hours.
You heard it. We'll be talking for 2 hours, so there's a lot to discuss. Make sure that you like and subscribe to our channel, and please share the link far and wide with everyone you know. Let's make sure that everybody joins in, because we are going to have an interesting discussion. We will talk about current affairs, Imran's recent trip to Afghanistan, where he was doing some research for his work, and we will talk about the Saur Revolution. Emran Feroz has written a couple of articles about the communist revolution 43 years ago in Afghanistan. And Ahmad Walid Kakar and we did a podcast about the Saur Revolution and Sardar Muhammad Dawood Khan last week. And we will also talk about Afghan diaspora in Western countries. So there is a lot to discuss, just 2 hours. It means we need to get started. So first of all, welcome, Imran. It's great to have you here again with us. The first ever podcast that we recorded, it was more than a year ago. You were our first guest, and when I look back, we've made a huge journey since. So how you been doing lately?
Yeah, assalamu alaikum again. Thanks again for having me. It's really a pleasure to be with you after more than a year. And as you just said, you really had a long journey, but I think you really made huge progress and great work. And I really appreciate that I'm allowed to talk again here. So yeah, I'm doing fine. At the moment, I'm a bit busy with writing a lot of different things. I have to finish a book until the end of May. So it's in German. It will be published in September, and it's about 20 years war on terror in Afghanistan. And besides that, I'm busy with producing radio shows, writing magazine articles in both mainly German, but also sometimes in English.
Okay, so I assume that you are also quite busy reporting on your recent trip to Afghanistan. How long did you stay there?
Yes, I returned from Afghanistan in March. I've been there a couple of weeks and was involved in different work. And unfortunately, most of the time I was forced to stay in Kabul because the situation was kind of different than in the past because of all these targeted attacks against journalists. You could really feel some kind of difference and fear, and you people were forced, journalists, media workers, were kind of forced to be more careful, even more than in the past. So I did actually a lot of things. Also in Kabul, there are many stories you have to cover, and I also went abroad for a trip to Konar, a reporting trip to Konar and Nuristan with my friend and colleague Fazl Mina Qazizai. You know him. He was also
Yes,
he
yes.
was part of your podcast. And I really enjoyed this trip because Qazizai Saib is a really, really cool person and a really skilled journalist. I would say he's one of the best people there who are constantly on the ground.
Yeah.
And recently we produced two pieces. One of them was for German national radio about rocket attacks, missile attacks from Pakistan that are taking place in Konar. And the other one was for Der Spiegel, a German magazine, which was also from Konar, and which was mainly focusing on some of the average Afghan soldiers on the ground you meet there, all the at the border, but also in other areas like Page Valley, Dare Page. And and apart from that, I mean, in Kabul, I was really, really busy with working on deportation issues. Afghan refugees who are being deported from European countries. And I met a lot of them too, from Austria, from Germany. And this was also really, really depressing topic, because in moments like that, you feel like, okay, you have this European passport and you can return now, and this guy, he's like doomed. So and apart from that, there are many other topics too.
Yes. When you were in Kabul and you traveled to Kunar and all the way up to northern Kunar and Nuristan, in those areas, did you see anything like, obviously, it's one of the most restive areas in eastern Afghanistan. Did you witness any fighting?
Yeah, so the thing is, we traveled mostly during the day. So when you travel during the day, often it's not so dangerous. I mean, you just have mainly these Afghan security forces checkpoints by Afghan police, by the Afghan military, and often these people don't make you problems. You just pass the checkpoints and continue your travel. And one thing that happened, which was really, I would say it was dangerous, and I also added this in the reporting because it was a really crazy situation. But it it happens very often in Afghanistan. It's a very daily thing. When we were in Konar, traveling from Konar, so if you go from Konar to Nuristan, you take the way through the Page Valley, through Dare Page, and so we were traveling on this route, and suddenly there was nothing, all the cars stopped, and it was kind of a traffic jam. You couldn't continue with your trip, and we heard some shooting. So I just took a look and what was going on. We saw two Afghan army Humvees about 20 meters in front of us, and the traffic was stuck, so we couldn't continue our travel. And Fazl Minallah was driving, so me and another friend of us from Konar, we got out of the car and took a look what was going on, and then we made some steps into the direction of the Humvees, and you could see a big a bit. You could see that the street was blown up because a mine exploded a few moments ago. A mine exploded, and two things were happening. You saw all these average travelers, Afghan civilians, who tried to repair the road by just taking some stones and putting them inside this big hole so that they could continue their travel. And at the same time, you saw these Afghan soldiers shooting at the mountain because apparently there were some Taliban hideouts. And nobody was shooting back, but it was clear that the mine that exploded moments ago was a Taliban mine, and they targeted some entourage of some local warlord who was known in this region. Someone who was some commander who I think it was like one night before, the son of this person was killed. Son of this commander was killed by the Taliban, and they were on the way to the funeral. So the Taliban tried to target this entourage and kill the guy himself. So he wasn't hit. I think this mine didn't kill anybody, as far as I remember. And what the thing was, first of all, and also, as I said, because of all the situation regarding the dangers journalists are facing in Afghanistan at the moment, I didn't want to start reporting, but this guy, the friend of mine from Kunar, he said to everyone, "Hey, here's a journalist. Here's a journalist." He started shouting around. Yeah, he said in Pashto, here's a journalist just arrived. Journalist just arrived. So he's making some pictures and stuff. So I grabbed my camera and started to make some pictures and short clips with my phone. And then I also started to interview some random people there. For example, some soldiers and some civilians, but mostly soldiers. Very short interviews, but I tried to catch the moment as good as possible. And for them, they were not hostile towards me. For them, it was crazy that in this moment suddenly journalists arrived from somewhere. And so, for example, there was a soldier. I made a short interview with him in Pashto, and then I listened that there was another guy who spoke Dari to one of the soldiers, and then he was from Kabul, so I started to speak Dari with him, and he looked at me and he was like, "What the fuck are you doing?"
Nobody goes there. Like in most cases, regular journalists very rarely venture in those dangerous areas. So it's obviously for people, it's quite a shock to see, like, what the hell is journalists?
Exactly, and especially journalists from Kabul, because mostly I'm disguising myself as a journalist from Kabul, and I just said I arrived from Kabul, and he was like, "Okay, yeah, make whatever you want."
Yeah.
And, it was kind of, but it was really, really paradox what happened there, because you saw people, all these normal travelers trying to fill up the hole, and then you see these soldiers shooting around, and then you see another soldier making pictures with the people. Everyone went to him and was like, "Yeah, let's make a picture together because there's a nice landscape in the background." And then you see other people just hugging each other, drinking tea as if it's just a normal break here. You see, I mean, if it's traffic jam here in Germany, you don't see so much fun like you saw there. People were really cool and relaxed somehow. Although this was a really dangerous situation, and fortunately nothing happened, and after 20 or 30 minutes we could continue our trip.
So that's so typical in a country where there is more than 40 years of war. People have become so accustomed to danger and the threat of being killed that they just behave as if nothing is happening. It's often very difficult for people outside Afghanistan to understand that. Like, for instance, when you come to Europe as a refugee, as a kid, people ask you, like, oh, you grew up in Afghanistan during the war, it must have been terrible. And as a kid, you don't know any better. So for people there, it's like normal. Only when you leave Afghanistan, when you come to a safe country where there is security, then when the dust settles, then most people start experiencing a lot of trauma. And I think that those people who you met there on the side of the road in Kunar, most of them have been accustomed to anxiety, and now they just, you know, they don't show it, but it doesn't mean that they're not suffering. And I think that's one of the biggest problems of the current conflict, is that we we need to be aware of how people are in constant state of fear, and they try to hide it. They don't show it, but
Yes.
it doesn't mean that they feel safe, or that they're not they don't feel any threat.
Exactly, yeah. And that's also why it's dangerous. You know, some people try to normalize it or say, you know, Afghans are like that, and, you know, Afghans don't show fear, and Afghans are not traumatized. I think, you know, that's not the case. It's as you said, people are kind of mass traumatized, and you know, it's not normal what they face. It's abnormal. And you know, when they leave, for example, as you described, when they come to Europe, they notice that this wasn't normal. And also, you know, as a journalist reporting from such a conflict, in such moments, you also often feel like, yeah, okay, it's kind of what you want to do. This is happening. It's your work to report about it, and to make the best out of the situation. And you always think like, okay, nothing will happen, nothing will happen. But back, you know, when you are back in Europe, or when you're just in a safe situation months later, and then you think back, or if you read your reporting, or you see your pictures you made there, you're like, man, what did I do? It was really dangerous.
Yeah, because when you are in a dangerous situation, you often maybe feel adrenaline rushes and everything, and your body and your mind basically adjust to the circumstances, and you operate under that situation the way you're supposed to operate. But it doesn't mean that is the normal you, because when you return back to safety, then you come back to your senses, and then you think, what I was thinking. What did I do? Yeah. Yes.
So Imran, so you've traveled to, let's say, because a lot of journalists obviously only travel in and around Kabul, and even in Kabul they only travel in and around certain parameters. So where else in Afghanistan other than Kunar have you traveled and reported from?
Yeah, you mean generally?
Yeah.
I have been, okay, let me try counting this. I've been to Wardak, to Nangarhar, to Paktia, to Khost, to Parwan, Baghlan, Balkh. And yeah, as I said, now I have never been to Kunar and Nuristan until this trip. So I added these two, and I'm not sure if I've forgotten anything. No, I think that has been all.
So is this the first time you've gone since the US Taliban, the Doha Agreement?
Yes, yeah,
So
exactly.
in your opinion, I mean, obviously, because before you used to go to, like you said, Paktia, Khost, Baghlan, you went to Kunar and Nuristan for the first time this time. But on the ground, obviously, bearing in mind that you went to a different place, what would you say the Doha Agreement has changed that you could observe? Because obviously, if you're there, you know, it's sort of your everyday kind of perspective, maybe but sort of from an outside perspective looking inward, what would you say has changed since the signing of the agreement?
You know, since the signing of the agreement, I think that for Afghans, many things haven't really changed. you know, if you're traveling around, you hear and see from the conflict, like you heard from it 1 year ago, 2 years ago, or 3 years ago. You know, for example, the situation in Konar. I mean, I faced similar situations, for example, in Baghlan, when you suddenly have a checkpoint or you see these Humvees and they're shooting at Taliban hideouts, and then you see these Afghan forces against the Taliban. And in this case, we didn't see the Taliban, but several areas of Konar are kind of controlled by them, or they are very dominant in these regions. For example, the Sheigal area, we wanted to go there, but it was very dangerous, so we couldn't do that. And also in Nuristan province, if you go deeper into the districts, you know that they are Taliban controlled. So this situation, I couldn't feel much change since then, since my last trips, and it's still very, very insecure, and the fighting is going on. But I think, you know, what really decreased in these rural areas are, for example, these airstrikes, drone strikes that have been very, very dominant in the past years, but decreased since the Doha deal. But, you know, at the same time, you also hear a lot of, you know, other atrocities by the Taliban, but also what has really increased during the last months, and I think even, you know, prior to the deal, but also afterwards, what you could see, you know, reports about all these night raids conducted by CIA-backed militias, which are very, very strong there in some regions. And this was also something that, for example, I have a friend. He was deported from Austria. I think 2.5 years ago. He was deported from Austria, and I wrote a really detailed piece about him. And I visited him, and he's originally from Nangarhar, and you know, the district where he is from. These raids are still taking place, and he described them that, you know, many people there during the last weeks, during the last months and years just joined the Taliban because of these raids are still happening. And on the ground, you know, of course, you also see a lot of Taliban violence still happening against Afghan forces and civilians. So, yes, the Doha deal, I think, didn't change much for many Afghans. And I have to repeat that, you know, this was one of the first times, or, you know, maybe, you know, it's always dangerous to report as a journalist from Afghanistan. But this time, because of all these targeted attacks, assassinations, you know, many journalists and media workers have been killed during the last months, and also in last year in Afghanistan, and other people have been targeted. So there was this climate of fear, and I also was kind of paranoid sometimes, especially when I was walking around in Kabul. I tried to be very careful. Or, for example, I interviewed one person who was the founder of an NGO for deported refugees. He's an Afghan. His name is Abdul Ghafur. Maybe you have seen his work in social media. And so what he did, or what one of his workers did, he was making a picture of us while I was interviewing him. And then he shared it on social media. And then I saw it, and I contacted him and said, hey, please delete this picture, because I try to be as undercover as possible. And for example, on my social media channels, I try to not be you know, so obvious with what I'm doing or where I am.
How are you?
Yeah, yeah. And so another thing that, for example, I had an interview with an Austrian news channel, and okay, in this interview you could obviously see that I'm in Afghanistan, and I think the anchor also mentioned something like that. And I described the situation there, and I shared this interview. But I thought, okay, it's in German and whatever, and it's not a big deal, and no, not everyone is following me. And I think just 1 or 2 days later, after it was aired, and after I shared this link, I got some messages and hints from people who were like, "Hey, specific people saw your interview. You also criticized the government, so be careful. Now everyone knows you're in Kabul." And I was like, I really didn't feel comfortable when I heard such things. So
how harsh was the criticism in the first place, though?
the criticism, actually, I had to think at first if I was really critical, because I just described the situation. I just said, so people are being killed here. There are targeted assassinations. There's still violence, and everyone is involved here. So we have the Taliban, we have the so-called Islamic State, but there are also government forces are also involved in this. This is not a secret. This is very obvious. Everyone knows that. But this was apparently more than enough to shake these people.
Yeah, because obviously it really damages the reputation of the government in Afghanistan if anybody claims that the government is involved in targeted assassinations, etc. So they don't want anybody to say that. So yeah, but while you were in Afghanistan during your stay, you said that you were mainly in Kabul. You traveled to Kunar and Nuristan, but in Kabul, did you get a sense of what people generally feel about the whole situation, the uncertainty with regards to the peace process?
Yes, of course. I mean, they had really a lot of problems because they were kind of, as Walid said, in the air. They don't know what will happen in the future and what kind of shape the government will take, and the whole situation will take. So this was really a problem that I think everyone was expressing. And in terms of the security problems in Kabul, people had two main complaints. One about these sticky bombs, these attacks with sticky bombs were happening every day, actually. And I think they kind of decreased now a bit. Maybe I'm wrong, but I haven't read so many reports I haven't heard much about such sticky bomb attacks during the last days or weeks. But when I was there, you could really, I often, a couple of times I heard such an explosion myself. One of them took place in front of the area where I was living. And so people were like, okay, now everyone can be killed through such a bomb. And, because there are apparently some people who stick these bombs under your car, and then, an average cab driver, normal people, workers, students, whatever, everyone can be killed. So these bombs spread a sense of fear. And another thing was, of course, as I said, these targeted assassinations, but also in general, the crime rate in Kabul. The crime rate is disastrous. You see people, that's what everyone keeps telling you. And, sometimes people say, yeah, no, everyone is saying the same. But when everyone is saying the same, you should take it seriously, because obviously it's a problem that everyone is sensing. That there are criminal groups, they're just targeting people, killing people for mobile phone, for some money, poor people. And of course, often in Kabul, I'm also with relatives and friends. And then you hear from someone who has been hit by such a group, who has been injured, or who has been killed, or yeah, who was just robbed by these people. And these things are very common. And so in Kabul, it's it's a very chaotic situation, I would say, and you don't feel the sense that there is anyone here who is controlling it.
Yeah, with regards to these criminal activities in Kabul, uh, you know, have you heard anything about sticky bombs being sold in the market in Kabul that you can
Yes,
just go and buy it?
yes, that's also something that many people keep saying, that you can buy them for, I think, 3,000 Afghani, something like that, 30 euros.
Okay.
And yeah, something like that. I think I've written it down because I made some reports about it. But you can get them very cheap, apparently, and there are many people. There is a large interest in such devices because, yeah, it's in all these climate, it's very easy for certain people to kill other people, enemies, critics, whatever, and nobody's asking who did it.
Yeah, because it's like with roadside bombs in the past, you know.
Yeah.
First, when the roadside bombs were introduced by the Taliban in Afghanistan, everybody assumed every roadside bomb is carried out by Taliban. But then, when everybody learned how to use roadside bombs, people would even use it against their own cousins and relatives with
Hmm.
whom they have disputes over water and land, etc. Uh, so I assume that in Kabul is the same because you know people can obtain a firearm illegally. Okay, you can buy a pistol, you can buy anything in the black
Yeah.
market. So if you have the intention to harm anybody, you can go and get it.
Hmm.
But with the thing with the roadside bomb is that I mean with the sticky bombs that they are using now in Afghanistan is that as soon as it is used, it is politicized.
Yes.
It has a political significance. So for that reason, I think it's also important to note that when a weapon like the sticky bomb becomes so popular and widely available, everybody's going to use it.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
exactly.
anyway, okay, we can talk about your trip more. Yeah, there's still so much to discuss, but we need to talk about your two recent articles because you have upset the whole tanky community recently. For our listeners, just a quick yeah, explanation of what happened recently. So the Afghan Communist Revolution, uh, it was the anniversary of the Communist Revolution. Recently, 43 years ago, the communists killed Sardar Muhammad Dawood Khan, the first president of Afghanistan, and this historic event is seen from different perspectives by people of different political persuasions, obviously. In Afghanistan, I would say absolute majority of people see this as a dark chapter in our history, because when the communists overthrew the Dawood Khan regime, that's when basically most of our current problems started. We have discussed this elaborately in our previous episode, but Imran, you wrote two articles, one for New Lines magazine and one for Foreign Policy. Let's just first talk about the foreign policy article, and then we will talk about the one in New Lines magazine. Can you tell us about the article in foreign policy? What
Yeah,
was the story about?
of course. So originally, the article for foreign policy I wrote, which was about the decade of democracy and the South Revolution. And I mean, originally it was much longer. And actually, I wrote it for Christmas 2020 when I had COVID. I was hit by COVID, and I wrote a very long article, and because of the invasion day of the Soviet troops, I thought that would be
Yes.
good timing, but I couldn't properly finish it, and sorry, and my editor was also a bit busy because of the holidays and everything, and so it wasn't published. And it took some time, and some weeks, and weeks, and then I was like, okay, maybe I can update it a bit and tie it to the Saudi Revolution, and interview some people. I already interviewed some people. I mean, I talked with many different people about these issues, and I just used two or three of them, added their voices, and so I convinced my editor to publish this quickly, which happened. So in this piece, I was focusing on, as I said, on the so-called decade of democracy, which started in the mid-1960s, introduced by the king, the last Afghan king, Zahir Shah. And during this time, the king tried to modernize Afghanistan and to democratize it. And the argument of the piece was that if this era, if this era was successful, if it had been successful, then maybe a lot of things wouldn't have ever happened, and maybe we could see a democratization from within. And because without romanticizing this era, because obviously Zahir Shah was also a controversial leader, and he did many mistakes. Like many Afghans keep saying, if you ask many Afghans, what do you think about Zahir Shah, they always say he didn't even build a tree. That's what you often hear. He didn't even build a tree. So of course you have to criticize these aristocratic elites and the monarchy, and but the thing is, there have been also, in my opinion, some kind of they tried to make some positive political developments, like in this era when you saw different things like parliamentary elections, and the king tried to introduce different people, and of course he installed them as prime minister. But if you compare these politicians to many Afghan politicians today, you still see that they were some kind of skilled. They had some kind of followership. They really had some kind of idealism to build their country, and also didn't ignore its realities. So what I did in this piece was focusing on such a person who was Muhammad Musa Shafiq, who was Shafiq was the last prime minister of the democratic era of Zahir Shah, and he ruled about a year, I think, so not really a long time. And the other person I focused on in this piece was, from the other camp, a radical political camp, which was not satisfied with the monarchy and with Zahir Shah, and they wanted to change Afghanistan by radical means. And this person was Hafizullah Amin, one of the leaders of the Afghan Communists, or the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. And so I tried to compare what these people tried to do, what kind of biography they had. And for example, both of them went to Columbia University in the United States. They studied there. And the big difference was that Shafiq also, Shafiq had a very traditional religious background. He was a Maulawi, so he himself. So he also went to Al-Azhar University in Egypt and studied there. And he was also from rural Afghanistan himself, from Kalmar district in Nangarhar province. So what he tried to do, in my opinion, was, mixing these modern global realities with Afghanistan's traditional realities, and trying to improve the situation in a honest way, and bringing change, but also without violence, and without re-educating people, or going after them and all these things. Why I'm saying that? I'm saying that because the Afghan communists, they had this idea. Hafizullah Amin became, this is also a funny thing, he became a radical leftist in the United States, and he was one of the few he was one of the few communists, one of the few Afghan communists, or leftists, because these people didn't like to call themselves communists. So he was one of the few persons of them who actually had no real connection to the Soviet Union. So the only thing I could find out was that when he once returned from the United States to Afghanistan, he had a stop in Moscow, and there he met some friend. I think it was the Afghan ambassador there, who was a friend of him, and he spent some days in Moscow. And after that, he became even more radicalized. So, after a few days there, but he was not the real asset of the KGB, because afterwards it became
KGB
years later.
actually thought he was a CIA asset.
Exactly, yeah. So even many other communists thought that this guy is a CIA asset, while many of these other known Afghan communists, like Nur Muhammad Taraki, or Babrak Karmal, or Muhammad Najibullah, who later became a president, they were known KGB assets, and they were also exposed later by a former Aykara of the KGB, Vitaly Mitrukhin, who I think his first name is Vitaly, but his second name is Mitrukhin.
Yeah.
So and he wrote not just about Afghanistan. He just exposed all the archive, and he wrote about from Africa, from African countries to Middle Eastern countries, to the Ba'ath Party, in Syria and Iraq, but then also, of course, he mentioned Afghanistan too. And but Hafizullah Amin wasn't one of these assets as far as we know today. And I tried to compare these two persons, Amin and Shafiq. And as I said, the original article was much longer, but the argument was that everything was shattered by two things. So first of all, the era of democracy was ended in 1973 by Muhammad Daoud Khan, Zahir Shah's cousin, who made the coup, but. I'm a bit,
I guess you could say that is what he made of the situation as
well. I'm fasting and I'm talking too much, so it's
okay.
So he made a coup, and this coup ended the era of democracy, and Daoud Khan became, as you mentioned, as you talked about this in much detail in your last podcast, in your last stream, about Daoud Khan's era, and he was kind of an authoritarian ruler, and first he was friends with the Afghan communists, and then he became this friendship was broken, and he went after them. At the same time, there were all these Islamist groups who were also active in Afghanistan or in Kabul during that time. And at the end, in 1978, Daoud Khan was killed by the Afghan communists when they staged their coup, the so-called South Revolution.
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing is, with regard to Zahir Shah, and I personally had that impression as well, that he didn't even plant a tree. But I think because so much has happened in Afghanistan over the last 40, 50 years, that, the history of the last 40 and 50 years is like you know, 1,000 times the history of what has happened in, let's say, peaceful countries in terms of the occurrences, different events, and whatever. But I think what a lot of Afghans don't realize is that in 1929, when Zahir's father took the throne, it was basically like starting off from zero all over again in terms of reinstituting the government, collecting taxes, whatever. And that sort of thing in a country like Afghanistan takes not years, it takes decades. And so, especially with Amanullah's experiment at modernization, they were very careful to not be too hasty, not to be too radical and whatever. And that is something I guess you could say with which Dawood himself disagreed, and that obviously ended up leading to the to Dawood's coup d'état. And another thing, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that yes, the king appointed prime ministers, but I think a lot of people don't realize what a constitutional monarchy is and how it comes about. It doesn't happen overnight. These sorts of things happen. If we look at, for example, Britain, English civil wars, you had the Republic, the Commonwealth, you had the Glorious Revolution. I spoke about it with Sangar in his podcast as well, because William of Orange was from Leiden in the Netherlands. But since then, there's been a consistent, not decades, but century-long process in which the role of Parliament and its role relative to the king becomes apparent. So if someone is going to come around and say, well, Zahir appointed Maywandwal or appointed Musa Shafiq, therefore this wasn't a real democracy and it was crap, then that's the most anachronistic crap that I've ever heard. But in any case, so that was your article on foreign policy.
Yeah.
And now you had arguably a more controversial article for New Lines magazine, which was published in the last week.
Yes.
What was that? What was that about? What was the aim of the article? What was the article about? And more importantly than everything, what was the reaction to it?
So this article for New Lines magazine was, you have to know the backstory how I started to write this thing. A few weeks ago, the CIA shared a tweet, remembering the history of its Stinger missiles and how they were once introduced to the Afghan Mujahideen, and more than 30 years ago. Almost 35 years ago, and it was just kind of an informative tweet remembering this. Of course, it was by the CIA Twitter account, but what happened afterwards was that many people on Twitter started to retweet this and sharing nonsense like conspiracy theories, like what happened afterwards. You sent the Stingers to Al-Qaeda, and at the end they kind of directed them back to us, and 9/11 happened, and all these kind of weird analysis. And first, I didn't think that it would take, it would have been shared so widely, but then I just took a look and checked some accounts and retweets, and I saw that thousands and thousands of people were sharing this. Okay, so I wasn't surprised about that, but it was still very, very massive, this kind of backlash. So what I did was I also retweeted it and started to write a short thread about, that, of course, these Stinger missiles were introduced to the Afghan Mujahideen, but all of this, was in a larger context, and the missiles were just a tiny part of Afghanistan's history during that time. But what many people kept doing was whitewashing this history and, spreading nonsense, not just regarding 9/11, but, people actually don't know much about this era, about the Soviet occupation, about the coup d'etat of the communists in 1978 and what happened afterwards. Tens of thousands of people have been killed by Nur Muhammad Taraki and Hafizullah Amin, and later by the other Moscow-installed regimes too. So Of course, I mean, the average Afghan fighter amongst the Mujahideen was not a rich warlord or some kind of famous person. Most of them were average Afghans who saw how their villages have been wiped off the map. And indeed, these people were happy when you gave them something like a Stinger missile years later, years later, because this was almost the final stage of the Soviet-Afghan war when the Stinger missiles were introduced. And so they used these missiles to shoot down Russian helicopters who attacked their villages. So, I just tried to summarize this a bit, and many people shared my thread. And New Lines magazine reached me out and asked me if I want to write a piece about that. And so that's what I did. I repeated many of the things I just mentioned, but I also, reached out some people who were involved in this, who were Mujahideen fighters back then, and
who are not Al Qaeda.
Exactly. Yeah, of course. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention it. What many people also try to do is, they're mixing the Mujahideen, Al Qaeda, and the Taliban. So for them, it's all the same, which is kind of, really Islamophobic or anti-Muslim, and it's a very anti-Muslim mannerism, because you just keep repeating all the war on terror rhetoric you see since 2001. But in this particular case, you see it from people who prefer to portray themselves as anti-war, as leftist, as anti-imperialist, and whatever. People who are normally very critical towards such rhetoric start using it themselves. And then they say things like, the Afghan communist government, it was a legitimate government, it was progressive, it was feminist, it was secular. So they're using these very, very, populist words without, in-depth meaning, and just repeating it over and over again, so that at the end, all over the world, the same thing happened. They have their ideological glasses, and all over the world, the same thing happened. For example, as an introduction, this was a coincidence, but when I wrote this article, I started to, I was busy reading a book by an American journalist who wrote about the so-called Jakarta method, and he wrote about the mass killings that took place in Indonesia in 1965 and 1966, when many, progressive leftists and other people who were against, these U.S.-backed right-wing forces in Indonesia, a lot of them were killed. About 1 million people were killed. So this book was focusing on Indonesia. And it was well written. It was very interesting. I didn't know much about these events in Indonesia. I have to be honest about that. It was good, but what he started to do from time to time was, comparing these events, which were of course very, very, disgusting. Everyone should condemn such mass killings and massacres, and it's something you should write about and talk about. And but what he started to do was, okay, so this happened here in Jakarta in Indonesia, and then something similar happened in Afghanistan. Something similar happened.
No context, just vibes.
Yeah, something similar happened in South America. Everywhere, right-wing forces. Of course, you have all this. It's just left and right, and the left is good and the right is bad. And then you have left-wing forces, democratic forces, who try to make their countries progressive and sovereign and independent. And then you have these right-wing contras, backed by the Americans, anti-communists, who are very, very fascist and whatever. And at the end, they try to, stencil every event, like, you have the bad guys on one side and the good guys on the other side. So this is also what is still happening in a lot of analysis regarding Afghanistan. People don't talk about the coup d'état. People don't talk about all these, horrendous crimes that took place during the communist dictatorships, and they're just like, we were in a good way, but the Americans supported the bearded radical extremist mujahideen, and they shattered everything. And finally, of course, at the end of it, 9/11 happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sangar.
Yes. So, what's so important about these articles that you have written and the podcast we have done last week is that in Western countries, generally, we have these obviously the leftists and the right wing movements and politicians, and they obviously also have their own media. We have like in mainland Europe. Generally, you see that state media has sort of a progressive left bias, but on occasionally they also tend to have very typical racist, anti-Muslim biases. But then we have independent private media, newspapers and magazines, and now more often strictly online outlets that are very ideological. What I saw in response to your article is that there were a lot of these guys who work for these independent news organizations, these reporters and journalists, people like what's his name, Ali Abu Mina and Rania Khalek, and these whole Max Blumenthal and all these leftist guys who are very anti-imperialist and anti-oppression, anti-Zionist and whatnot. In fact, Max Blumenthal, the creator of the Gray Zone, he introduced the gray zone as a response to ISIS and the right-wing extremists targeting Muslims. The gray zone was introduced as an independent new venture trying to shed light on Islamophobia and racism, etc. But now it has gone fully into a propaganda outlet promoting the narrative of Kremlin and Bashar al-Assad. So
Yes.
these guys, they are not fringe groups. Like in universities, even in very prominent journalists who work for mainstream media, they have the same views and ideas about the world, like the West, America, Western countries. They're all capitalist and they are evil, and anybody who opposes them, they must be right. They must
Yeah.
be on the right side. So you see a lot of whitewashing of Mao Zedong. Okay, so when Mao was still, when there was war going on in China between the nationalists and the communists, there were Western leftists who went to China and they were reporting and glorifying Mao, and they wrote books about him. And similar things happened during the Vietnam War. Obviously, the Vietnamese, they were also supported by the Soviet Union. They were communists, but there were Western journalists who basically made it appear like the Vietnamese, they're entirely innocent, that the Viet Cong. And a decade later in Afghanistan, with the communists, we had the same issue. Many leftists in Western countries had a very strong anti-imperialist bias, and they saw anything that is against Western interest or against Western hegemony as good. and now we live 30 years later with generations of young people graduating from universities with these T-shirts with pictures of Che Guevara and hats with hackle and the communist logo. What is it called? The thing, or they have on social media, they have that icon on their Twitter handle. And these people, they have never experienced communism. They have never been in any of those countries where people are being systematically subjugated. They see everything as all Western bias and Western propaganda. And
Oh, I have a story to tell you about that. So,
yeah,
a couple.
I wanted to come to that. So something recently happened. Okay, there are a lot of these groups and communities, and there was a you mentioned Vitaly Mitrokhin. Vitaly Mitrokhin. There is another guy, very infamous, Yuri Bezmenov, also a former KGB guy, who basically explained how in countries outside Soviet Union, the KGB tried to manipulate people by mobilizing anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist movements. And I've seen that video, those interviews of Yuri Bezmenov several times. But recently we received an invitation, Walid received an invitation from a group, and he will tell us all about it. So, Walid, what happened? Come on.
So essentially, I got invited to a panel organized by the Black Alliance for Peace. And so the Black Alliance for Peace had reached out to me because they saw the podcast Sangar and I had recorded about the Afghanistan Study Group's report. And for those people that haven't seen the podcast or that won't see the podcast, essentially there was a report compiled and which advised President Biden essentially to walk back on the Doha Agreement, to break it, to adopt a conditions-based sort of approach to it, in order to ensure that the US stays in Afghanistan up until a desirable sort of outcome is met. But the people that were writing this report, a lot of them had a conflict of interest. They sort of had ties to the military-industrial complex. They sort of people. The co-chair, for example, was Joseph Dunford, who served in Afghanistan, led operations for many years, now sits on the board of directors for a company called Lockheed Martin, which is one of the biggest arms producers in the world. And so this organization reached out to me and they were like, look, we are opposed to American imperialism. We're opposed to the US war in Afghanistan, whatever. And I was like, you know what, great. They gave off very sort of left-wing vibes, but I was like, you know what, it's for the greater good, whatever, we'll get past this. But essentially, whilst I was sitting on the panel, I sort of indicated that the US war in Afghanistan is justified through a variety of different lenses. One of those is the counterterrorism mission, and the counterterrorism mission is the one that I personally, I know someone's going to take this out of context, it's the one I like the most because it has the least amount of crap attached to it. It doesn't try to sugarcoat anything. I'm a blunt person and I just appreciate the fact that that's blunt. But then I said, obviously, it's also justified through the prism of women's rights. And that's not something that's new for Afghanistan, because women's rights and sort of secular, progressive, liberal sort of utopia was the aim of the Afghan communists as well. And that was how they justified their fight against the Mujahideen. And the Soviet invasion was also justified along those lines. But in that panel sat with me was Vijay Prashad, who was a historian, who was an author, who was rather infamous. And afterwards, sort of in the course of the discussion, obviously, because there were other people in the panel and I couldn't obviously take all of the space myself, Vijay Prashad said that what I said was that when the communist government came in 1978, it launched all of these decrees of the redistribution of land. It got rid of this system in Afghanistan we have called Grawi, right? which is sort of a land sort of rental system. I don't really know how to translate it into English right now, and it'll take too long. But I was like, it got rid of all of these things through the prism of sort of Stalin's collectivization of farms, the kulaks. But what that did was that it decimated the agriculture of the country. It led to sort of total carnage. Agricultural production went down. The same farmers it was supposed to help got screwed over and ended up joining the Mujahideen. And the women's rights thing that was being used in conjunction with Pule prison, being basically a rape center for man, woman, and child. So the feminist progressive credentials of this regime were very much something we could doubt. And now Mr. Prashad came along and was like, no, well, I interviewed Anahita Ratibzad, and she was a patriot. And they wanted to, they wanted to do good for their country. And it was like, yeah, well, I want to be a multimillionaire, but I'm not. So what I want to do isn't really relevant, right? But you know, she was a patriot, and they really were motivated, and they had good intentions. And the thing is that Sangar mentioned this in our podcast with Dawood Khan. Dawood Khan, we could say, was, you know, for all of his flaws, a patriotic man. He cared about his country. He wanted to improve his country. But like I said, I also want to be a millionaire, and that's, you know, it's not really relevant to what I do. And Aitara Tibzad, the same thing, right? Her government was responsible for mass killing, mass rape, mass displacement. And then later on in the panel, during the course of discussion, which I wasn't involved, there was sort of talk of China, right? Now, China and what it's doing to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And obviously, I'm not qualified to give a full-length rebuttal to some of the claims that are being made. And I wouldn't want to either, because it's not my area of expertise. But essentially what I'm hearing in this panel from Prashad is that the US is encouraging Islamic radicalism in China, that Daesh are infiltrating Xinjiang or East Turkestan, and that is why re-education is going on, right? And that was when I was like, yo, like, damn. Like, because the thing is that all three of us are suspicious inherently of Western propaganda. We know how Western propaganda was instrumentalized to facilitate the invasion of our country, right? But if we've been observing over the last 2 years, we keep noticing that China's stance on whatever is happening is changing. It goes from there is nothing there to these are voluntary re-education camps to mandatory. Like, it keeps changing. It looks very suspicious. And then you keep hearing a louder and louder chorus of people from there, people that have actually experienced it, saying this is what is happening, right? And so this is being completely whitewashed under the guise of Islamic radicalism. The same Islamic radicalism, Prashad was going on about US imperialism, whatever, the same Islamic radicalism that the US imperialism instrumentalizes, he is now using to defend China genociding people, which has now been recognized as a genocide. Mm-hmm. So I was sat there and I was like, man, I'm sick to my stomach. Why the hell did I join this? But yeah, I mean, they also sort of went on that Gulbuddin Hikmatyar is the worst thing to ever come out of Afghanistan. Now, everyone by this stage knows my father was in Hizb Islami. I'm not going to sit here and be like, no, actually, he was the best thing. Right? but the worst thing to come out of Afghanistan, really, whilst you're whitewashing Khalq and Parcham. So, yeah, I mean, I now have sort of, I mean, I always knew these people existed. I always knew that sort of these sorts of really reductionist, simplistic understandings of global politics history exist. But this was my first time seeing it sort of right in my face, and yeah, it was pretty disgusting.
Thanks for all the insight. I have a lot of thoughts that I have to share with you about all the things that you just mentioned. So not sure where to start, but one thing that was very obvious after this, my New Lines article was published, is that many Syrians liked it. Okay.
Yeah.
So many people with a Syrian background shared this article and sent me private messages and really appreciated it. And this has an obvious reason. The people of Syria are making similar experiences for a couple of years now, because the very same people like you mentioned, Vijay Prashad, or people like Sangar mentioned, Max Blumenthal, Rania Khalek. I know Max Blumenthal personally. I know these people for years, and I know how they changed, how they used to be, what kind of agenda they used to have, and how it changed suddenly, and how for a couple of years now they're just participating into genocide apologism and whitewashing war crimes in a very, very absurd way. For example, there is another guy. His name is Aaron Mate, who is involved in huge propaganda, just Russian state propaganda, and he's targeting Bellingcat. Bellingcat, journalistic outlet, investigative outlet, which makes great work from Syria to Russia. They are really, this is journalistic expertise. That's what they are doing. And of course, you can criticize minor things in a normal discourse, but he's going after them, and he wants to stubbornly whitewash war crimes conducted by the Assad regime. And the reason why so many Syrians reacted positively is that they made very, very similar experiences. And I think there are, when I started with journalism, I started to write for a lot of left-wing outlets. I still write for a lot of different left-wing outlets here in Germany and Austria. And of course, not all of them are like super tanky or something like that, but some of them. And I could, first of all, I was just happy to get published, okay, years ago. So, and I think many people with our background, at first are happy to just get published, or as the experience you made, Walid, getting a stage to talk, when this organization reached you out. And I have also participated in many, or in a couple of left-wing, organizations, events and stuff. So I'm very familiar to that. The thing is, when I started, first, I was writing about the war on terror, about the Americans, all these things, about Guantanamo, about drone strikes, and they were happy to hear it. They were pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. And I was like, okay, it's good, it's fine, people read my stuff, it's good. So after some time, I started to write, for example, about Afghan mercenaries fighting in Syria, the Fatimiyun militia.
Yeah.
I was writing about this a couple of years ago. I think in German media, I was one of the first persons who was writing about that. And so I criticized the regime, and I criticized Iran. People, actors, players that are not often criticized by the people we mentioned, by these tankies. And so then I started to write more about the Soviet occupation, because I was
And then
like,
they really didn't like that.
yeah, I had a situation when an editor, it was here German weekly newspaper, and the editor who commissioned the piece was a friend of mine, so he was cool with that. He was like, yeah, maybe you can write something about that, because many leftists don't know about this and are just sharing propaganda, and this is so stupid. So he commissioned a piece about this, and I wrote something like that, about the coup and all that. And then his editor-in-chief, a woman I also know personally, she freaked out. Okay, she was much older. She was young when the Soviet invasion took place. So she freaked out. She was like, "We are not going to publish this." And
Yeah, in sort of my village, we'd say Zara Gunakara.
yeah,
As they say in Urdu, Purana Papi. Purani Papi.
Yeah, so this is something that I noticed, and then I started to understand more and more that these people they also just want to hear certain narratives. They are not interested in a normal discourse. they're even often worse than the so-called mainstream media, which is the super evil. But the mainstream media, many mainstream media outlets I'm writing for, have never censored me, have never said something like that. I criticized the Americans, they were fine with it. I criticized the Soviets, they were okay with it. And for a long time, actually, I thought that at least the things that happened during the Soviet occupation in Afghanistan, these are common facts. It's nothing to talk, to dispute. Nothing disputed. So you don't have to debate much about it. But today I know it's not the case. There are certain cases in history, Afghanistan, Chechnya, Bosnia, Syria, and also China now, where there are all these places. You see these people pushing their narratives, and I think it's totally disgusting to hear people like Vijay Prashad. Vijay Prashad, who is Vijay? What does this guy know about Afghanistan? He's also a hardcore Assad apologist. So what does this guy know about Syria? What does this guy know about China or Bosnia? And as I said before, I know Max Blumenthal. I was friend with Max Blumenthal because in the past, he started to introduce Gray Zone with an American progressive media outlet called Alternet. And at first, Gray Zone looked very good. It was, many different Muslim writers were writing for it from Europe, about the events in France, about the far right in Germany. I made different reports from Afghanistan and from Germany and Austria, and it was fine. But then he started. There was a turning point when he started to attack the Syrian white helmets. He did this.
They always do that. The white helmets are public enemy number one.
There are two main propagandists in Syria, Vanessa Bili and Eva Bartlett, I think. So these two were, hardcore Assad propagandists who also disguised themselves as, pro-Palestine activists and all these things. And they started to attack the white helmets. And of course, the Russian state media and Syrian state media, regime media also started to attack the white helmets. And suddenly, Max Blumenthal wrote a so-called expose attacking the white helmets, that they are just terrorists and Al-Qaeda, and that they are funded by the Americans and all. Many people were shocked because a few times, I think 2 or 3 years before that, he actually left Al-Akhbar, which was a Lebanese newspaper. Max Blumenthal was writing for this newspaper, and he left Al-Akhbar, and he said, I'm leaving them because everyone has the right to resist, including the Syrian people, to resist against their dictator. So he had a very strong anti-Assad stance, and many people welcomed it. But suddenly he changed. There are different stories why this happened. I don't have to discuss all them, but then he started to whitewash, sell war crimes, attacking people who actually rescue, attack people of victims of war crimes and injured people on the ground. These first responders, he started to attack them, and then what happened was, of course, many people also welcomed this piece, what he wrote back then about the white helmets. But I think something happened, and he had to leave Alternet because many people, were not happy, and I think maybe Alternet itself also wasn't happy about what happened back then. So then he started to make Gray Zone as his own, and created the whole website and everything. And I remember that few months before that happened, I still had some contact with Max Blumenthal, and he asked me about some events in Afghanistan. For example, maybe you can remember that in the United States there was an attack when an Afghan, I don't know what, this guy killed several people in a queer club, something like that.
Yeah. 2016, I think.
This guy.
Omar Mateen.
Yeah, this guy
This,
staged this brutal attack and
yeah,
killed
yeah.
several people. And I don't know what was going on. Max Blumenthal reached me out and asked me, "Hey, I'm writing something about this guy and about Afghanistan." I was like, "Okay, what is he writing about Afghanistan? What does he know about Afghanistan?" And he had some questions, and I said, "Of course, send your questions over." And then he said the family of Omar Mateen went to the United States, I think in the early 1980s, something like that, okay? And he asked me, why did they come to America in the early 1980s? And I said, yeah, because there was war in Afghanistan, because the Soviets invaded the country. And then, okay, I didn't know that, so kind of like, it makes sense. Or for example, it was obvious for me that he didn't know anything about these things. Or Rania Khalek, which you mentioned, which also reacted after she read my New Lines article. Rania Khalek asked me a few years ago. I don't know her personally, but we were chatting from time to time. And back then, she also had a very different stance. She was writing about Assad war crimes, and she was totally different than today. And then something happened. So back then she asked me, I read some history about Afghanistan and it reminds me of Syria. And I was like, okay, what did you read? And then she was like, yeah. And then she was like, yeah, there was some literature about this guy, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And I was like, yeah, of course. Okay, I'm not sure what exactly you read, but yes, this guy was a Mujahideen leader, turned into a brutal warlord. All that is known, but this is just a fragment of the history. So what do you want to compare specifically? And yes, she didn't. I answered a bit in detail and tried to describe the Soviet occupation, the communist coup, and all these things, but she didn't appear to be much interested in that. And
they never tend to be.
Yeah. So the thing is, you have these people, and they don't know much about these regions and the specific history of these regions and of these people. And they are just, everything is the same. The US supported right-wing people, and progressive governments have been destroyed, and regime change. They always like this word, regime change, regime change. Actually, the Soviets did a regime change when they killed Hafizullah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And installed Babrak Karmal. And I really often I think it makes sense to compare what is happening in Syria to the communist era of Afghanistan, because you have the Assad regime, which is also describing itself as progressive, secular,
I mean, Arab, they're Ba'athists, Arab socialists. So even ideologically, in terms of that there is a parallel there.
Exactly. Yeah. But the thing is, and this is really, we live in the 21st century, and in Syria, many war crimes are very well documented. You have a large Syrian diaspora, which is very, very aware of what is going on, and they are very, very radical not radical in a bad way. They're radical in a positive way. They challenge these stupid narratives, and they're reclaiming the narratives of their people and their country. And when they see people in Europe, making propaganda for Assad, they are challenging him and saying, hey, what is wrong with you? For example, in Germany, this is very, very controversial, because often you see anti-war demonstrations. This was a few years ago, anti-war demonstrations against U.S. military involvement in Syria, okay? And most of the people who participate in these demonstrations are white German people who don't know anything about Syria. And often you even see Syrians demonstrating against such people, because they say, please don't listen to them. They don't know anything. They're just repeating propaganda. And so this is really a problem I often see. And
this reminds me of something that also happened here in the Netherlands. It is often described as the Red-Brown Alliance.
Yeah.
Okay, so the red are the communists and brown are the ultra nationalists. You know, the basically the Nazis.
Yes.
With regards to Syria, there is this. You see this convergence of interest between the communists in Western countries and ultranationalists. They protest together. They rally together here in the Netherlands. There were
Yes, in
many
Germany.
such protests where far-right extremists from different European countries, people who are basically very open about believing in superiority of their own race and of their own whatnot, those people were defending the Assad regime.
Yes.
Okay, and their bedfellows are these anti-racist, anti-Islamophobia, pro-LGBT
Mhm.
leftists with their banners, and then you think, what is it that is uniting you guys here? What draws you together? And when this happened several times here in the Netherlands, I thought maybe this is an anomaly. But then I saw that the same thing is happening in Germany. There are the same type of figures also appearing in Fox News. Like, for instance, Glenn Greenwald,
Yes.
famous leftist, the guy who broke the Snowden story. He is now parroting
Yeah.
a lot of
With Tucker
these.
Carlson. He's now with
Yes, yes, with Tucker Carlson. Yes,
Yeah, it's very unfortunate because in the past, I liked the journalism of Glenn Greenwald. He
yeah,
even endorsed my drone book. So, yeah, it's kind of weird what is happening with these folks. But what I also wanted to say is that, so yeah, I mean, we see all these whitewashing regarding Syria, and I wonder what I mean. Even in the 21st century, we have Twitter, we have YouTube, we have all these technological developments, but it is still happening, and many people still believe these fake news. So I wonder what would have happened if the Soviet occupation and the Sour Revolution didn't take place 40 years ago, but 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I think it would be ridiculous what kind of nonsense we see. And another thing I noticed is that, as I said, the Syrian diaspora is very aware of this and is trying to challenge it in a very, very constructive and positive way. But I have a friend of mine. He is chief editor of a magazine I'm writing from time to time in here in Germany, and this magazine is called Kantara. So it's focusing on the Middle East and the MENA region, and also in Central Asia, South Asia. And he has a Palestinian background, and he's a very educated person. And he's often making very good analysis when it comes to the Arab Spring and to the revolutions in all these Arab countries. And one day he told me of an Afghan colleague of him, okay, a person who used to be a journalist, an Afghan, and he asked me if I know him, and I said no, unfortunately not. So what's going on with him? And he said, yeah, this person, he's kind of weird. For example, Emran, when you talk about Afghanistan, I respect it, and for me, it's gaining knowledge. And one day I was talking about Libya, and then this Afghan guy was like, yeah, it's just the Americans, and the regime change. Yeah, and then he was very surprised, and he said, why is this guy saying that? Because often many of these tankies, Western tankies, are saying that, but why is he saying that? And I said, yeah, I don't know. He's stupid person. He's not informed. Don't take him seriously. But this is something that actually I have to say. And as you said, we were talking about the Afghan diaspora too.
yeah.
Unfortunately, I sometimes I wish the Afghan diaspora would be as aware and as
Active.
active as the Syrian diaspora, which, the Syrian diaspora is very young comparing to the Afghan one.
Okay, so
Yeah.
why isn't the Afghan diaspora? I'm gonna put this question to both of you, right? And it's the most
Okay.
open-ended question in the world.
Emran,
Why
go. You're
why
first.
do we wait, let me finish the question, right? Because I need to make it as juicy as possible. Why do we see that the Afghan diaspora proportionally seems to be more disinterested or more uninformed about Afghanistan than, let's say, for example, the Syrian diaspora or other diasporas are? Because you could say, oh, well, in Afghanistan, there's sort of a multiplicity of different factions and everyone is really confused. And in the West, people don't really know what's going on. But that's the same for Syria as well, right? In Syria, there isn't one faction. It's not just your pro-government or anti-government. Things are obviously much more complex than that. What's the problem with the Afghan diaspora? And I say that as Afghan diaspora.
That's a very last
خدای
question.
په کار کا کردی.
That's, it's an important question, and I think but it's still very difficult to answer. I just try to summarize my own observations I did during the last years, and maybe you can use the summary as part of an answer. So the thing is, first of course, the Syrian diaspora is not homogeneous, and the same goes for the Afghan diaspora. I grew up in Austria in a very isolated place with, until I was 16, 17 years old, 15, 16 years old. I didn't know any Afghans around me, okay? So the first Afghan friend I have was when I was 15 years old, and he's still, my best friend. So before that, I didn't know much Afghan people, and I also didn't know how different these diaspora groups are in terms of, for example, in Germany, you have people who come from Mujahideen families. They arrived earlier in the 1980s or in the late 1970s. And then you have many people with, families having a communist background, people who arrived in the early 1990s. And these people also clashed when they met each other. I think the same was the case in the Netherlands, where Sangar lives. I'm not sure how it is in the UK. I have one uncle in the UK. He lives in Scotland, and he went there 40 years ago. So, but I don't know how it is, how the landscape there is. And then now, especially in the last years, for example, also in Austria, my hometown in Innsbruck, you see many Afghans who, the number of Afghans increased hugely, and you see people who recently fled from war and conflict, and you see also a lot of people who spend a lot of time in Pakistan or especially in Iran, and are now living as refugees in Europe. And when it comes to the Afghan diaspora and why they are so, as I said, they're not homogeneous, and instead of coming together, I think they often clashed with each other. And you saw, the former communists and the former Mujahideen fighting each other here, continuing their fights when they, everyone was creating his or her organization. And I mean, there are also other people, for example, Afghans who were close to the king's family, okay, in the diaspora. I know also such people. And, so there was often this kind of internal dispute, which led to more fragmentation instead of more unification. And you see, for example, in Germany, I don't know how many Afghan organizations you have here, because every week a new organization is popping up. Okay? Yeah, and we are Afghans, and we want to do this, and we want to do that, and sending food to entering politics somehow.
Yeah.
and so this is one thing. For example, regarding my own work, what I often noticed is that also after these recent articles, Sometimes I see some people, Afghan diaspora kids who grew up in Europe, where you can just see that they're repeating what their parents told them. Okay, they're just repeating the political views of their parents. If the father was a Khalqi, they are saying what the father was saying. If the father was a Parchami or the mother was a Parchami, the communists had two fractions, so the Khalq and the Parcham, and seeing repeating all this stuff. Also, often with many kids from Mujahideen families, I see similar stuff. And
as someone
another
that
thing,
comes from a Hizb Islami family, I feel deeply offended at the moment.
Yeah, in my case, it's mixed. I mean, my mother's family was also Hizb Islami, and my father's family was kind of apolitical, but not really Mujahid, but also not really. My paternal grandfather was not a Hizbi communist, but he knew all these people, Amin and Karmal and Taraki. I think we also talked about this when I was your guest 1 year ago.
Back Anis magazine.
Of course, and he was the editor-in-chief of the Anis magazine, and also these old men from that era, everyone knew each other. Okay, for example, Süleyman Layık, who was a known poet and a leading ideologue of the Afghan communists. His family was banned to Baghlan, where my maternal family is coming from. So he also visited often the house of my maternal grandfather, who was also a poet. And young Süleyman Layık was aspiring poet, and he went to this old man, to my grandfather, and was like, hey, maybe you can help me with these poets. So everyone knew each other, and although they have different opinions, for a long time they still respected each other somehow, and it was fine. It was not a healthy political debate for a couple of years.
Emran,
so yes,
I think you really need security in Germany, because you first criticized communists, and now you claim that your grandfather basically taught Süleyman Layık how to write poetry. Now I think they're going to kill you.
So the thing is that, for example, what I also often noticed is that many Afghan diaspora people from the United States explicitly share what I'm writing about the Afghan communists, the Soviet occupation. Why? Because most of them, their families fled after the coup or during the occupation. So I think a large part of the Afghan diaspora in the United States has some kind of Mujahideen background also. And for example, contrary in Germany, you see many communist kids. And so I'm not sure.
We have Sangar, who's like the polar opposite of all of those, who went the complete different direction.
Yeah, there are also some cases like that, of course. But I mean, not sure if I answered your question. I guess not. I mean, it's difficult to answer this, but because it's really a very, very fractured diaspora with many different agendas. I think what is, for example, the case in London, you have Pashtun nationalists, a separate group. You have Tajik nationalists, a separate group.
Yeah, we don't encounter any of those. Like I've always come across those kinds of people online on Twitter. I don't even know that these people existed, honestly.
Yeah.
Like until I came on Twitter, and especially until they started hurling insults at me, I had no idea that these people existed or that they were as active as they are. But I think the ethno-nationalisms amongst Afghan diaspora as well are a major problem.
Yes, exactly.
And at times, I don't know, I'm going to posit another question to you guys. A lot of the times people say, oh, well, in Afghanistan, people don't really care about ethnicity, and this is all in the diaspora, okay? So, but obviously that's an exaggeration. Ethnicity is a factor. It is a reality. Exaggerated, we could say it is, But are these people more susceptible towards ethno-nationalism because of their Western background and education and the fact that they're diaspora and they may have an identity crisis? Is that leading to an increase of this phenomenon? Or are their parents normal citizens to everyone else, but deeply racist at home?
If I may, what I think what's important to understand here is that in Afghanistan, when new modern ideas were introduced, Western ideas, as we discussed in our previous episode about ethnicity, nation state, nationality, people assume that these things are a necessity. You have to have a very strong identity based in an ethnicity, in a language, and a mythology. And if you don't have that, you're empty. You're a nobody. So they don't have any spiritual. How do you say?
This is very relevant with Ramadan.
Yes. So the life when people from our background, when they are influenced by Western ideas, often they become very secular. Okay, and when they become very secular, their whole existence becomes very empty. And when their existence is empty, they try to replace it with new gods, new deities. So these new gods and new deities are either social justice or ethnic superiority, racial superiority, etc. So what happens is that, partially answering also your previous question, in Western countries, vast majority of Afghans are people who were educated, people who had jobs, and people who had some kind of exposure to Western thought and Western ideas. So in general, most Afghans are either leftists of the communist strand or leftists who weren't communists, because bear in mind, a lot of these Afghans who are in United States and who hate the communists, a lot of Afghans who are in United Kingdom as well, they hate the communists, but they share the same ideas and beliefs. They just disagree with which party they should support. So what these people, when they move to Western countries and they settle in these Western countries, their children are born and raised there. These children are not raised with any kind of spiritual education. In my case, like my parents, they were both very secular and they were very active. Not my mother, but my father. He was a member of Hizb Democratic Khalq Afghanistan. He worked for the Najib government in a very high post. He still believes in socialism, although he disagrees with his party and whatever they did, but he is still ideologically that person. So when people like me, when they are raised in Western countries, they are not thought to believe in a hereafter, and they are not thought with belief that they, as human beings, that their existence has a deeper meaning or whatever. It's just materialism. It's just empty materialism. So when you have that kind of belief system and you live in a country where people see you, in German they call you Schwarzkopf, because you have black hair. In the Netherlands they just call you Turk. Or in America,
In the UK, they call you a Paki.
So they here you are in this country and you believe that you are very secular and progressive and developed and enlightened, and you come in this country and they treat you as second-class citizen. You feel humiliated because they don't see you as equal. So obviously, if you're a teenager, if you're 15, 16 years old, then you will start to look for an identity. for something to be proud of, something that will make you feel like I am somebody, I am something. So in most cases, what happens is these people, they look at miniatures of old Persian whatnot, and they will read about how Pashtuns ruled the whole world and whatnot, and then they either become Pashtun nationalists, or they become Tajik nationalists, or they become Hazara nationalists, and then their whole existence revolves around that. And even when they become older, they become adults, and they start working, and they become active in community, or they work for NGOs, or they travel back to Afghanistan to become politically active, they still carry this baggage of these twisted ideas in their heads. So when they're finally in Afghanistan, they act in a very toxic manner. And this is what you see, like, for instance, Afghan diaspora who traveled back to Afghanistan, they work for the government, and if they have a Pashtun background, then they shout, "Death to Alipur, Alipur is a terrorist." And if they have a non-Pashtun background, they say, "You fascist, how dare you to say kill Alipur." So you see that they're still stuck. They're still stuck in that paradigm. They cannot escape it. And in my opinion, for Afghan diaspora, it is very important to make sure that especially the younger ones, because the ones who are now adults and people of our age and older, I'm sorry to say that, but these people are lost cases, okay? You may disagree with that, but once people become like 20... Yeah, Amin. But we have to focus on the younger ones, because they are exposed to a lot of very one-dimensional, narratives of what happened in Afghanistan, about how recent history. And this is why also, what we are doing with the podcast and all these amazing articles that Emran has written, this is basically telling the story of Afghanistan from a perspective that most people, even Afghans who are in Western countries, have never heard before. Yeah. And they were not exposed to it before. So it is a necessity that this happens. It's important that these stories are told by Afghans and by people like, okay, I'm not going to say that we are somehow any better than everybody else, because obviously we have our own biases. We are also human beings. We're not perfect, but at least what we are trying to do is be open and honest about it, that these different perspectives exist. And, yeah. and the only way we can engage in a dialogue is talking about facts that we can agree on. Like, for instance, there are certain facts. Yeah. Please.
I'm gonna ask Emran the same question, and then we have a couple of questions in the live chat and on Twitter from Suzanne Schroeder.
I saw it just now, yeah. But it's fine. Emran, I still have time. It's relaxed.
No. Yeah. But I was gonna ask you the same question, Emran. So Sangar, go ahead, finish, and then I'm gonna ask Emran
okay.
the same question.
I totally forgot what I was saying,
Oh, sorry about that, man. The audience, the people watching are probably going to be like, "Damn, this guy."
Yeah.
But you were talking about facts that we can agree on.
Yes. There are certain facts that we can agree on. If any political entity in Afghanistan engages in mass killing of people, then we should condemn that. Yeah. It doesn't matter if it's simple. If it's your father or my father, if it doesn't matter if it's your uncle or my uncle, condemn it. Yeah. It's very simple.
Yeah. So, Emran, what makes the Afghan diaspora more predisposed toward being ethno-nationalist? Is ethno-nationalism more of a reality in Afghanistan that's covered up because people are nice about it? Or is there a real problem that in the diaspora, for the reasons Sangar mentioned, people become more secular, distant from their culture and the role that religion and culture plays in their life, and they look for it elsewhere and become ethno-supremacists? What's at the core root of all of this, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think Sangar already made a lot of important points. I think what what I should add, maybe, I mean, I know also a lot of religious people from Hazara to Pashtun to Tajik who are also, disguise themselves as kind of ethno-nationalist. I mean, of course, you can argue with them that from an Islamic point of view, this is wrongdoing, but they still, act like that. So I think that, of course, on the ground, I remember when during my reporting trip, I was in Kabul. I was in a in a Jogi camp. You know the Jogi people.
Yeah.
They don't call themselves often Jogi. They some of them call themselves Magot, and some others just also they just say we are 41 Afghans. So we don't like to be called Jogi because Jogi is like gypsy or something like that. It has a bad connotation. And I was interviewing some people in their camp in Kabul, and next to their camp were Pashtun refugees from Helmand. Okay, and these Pashtun refugees from Helmand, they took more land than the Jogis. Of course, they had better connections to people in the government, to the parliament. The Jogi people are a very, very marginalized people. They don't have political representatives. A lot of them don't have a taskara. The majority of them don't have a taskara. And other Afghans, keep saying stuff like, go back to where you come from. You're not a legitimate citizen of Afghanistan. And they face a lot of racism. For example, one of these guys told me that he has many friends, but he doesn't tell them that he's from the camp because if he would tell the truth, they would know that he's a Jogi, and then they would say bad things to him. They would exclude him. They don't even have cemeteries. They have a lot of problems. So they were saying things like, we are here, but we don't have much rights. Next to us are these Pashtun refugees, and unfortunately, they have better connections than us, and we can't do much. So I just straight asked the question. I was like, okay, so you think they are benefited because of their ethnicity? And then he said, he was like, yes, I think so, because they have representatives. I mean, our president is even somehow linked to them because there was some kind of specific group from Helmand. I think some of them were Kuchi people, and so he said yes. So this is a reality on the ground that we're excluded because we are not like them, and they are also refugees. They're IDPs, but they have much more rights than we have. But at the same time, he also said, unfortunately, this is a reality because our leaders play with these things. Then he asked me. He asked, "May I ask what is your background? Where are you coming from?" And so the funny thing was that a lot of these Jogis were from Baghlan. They know many family members of mine, and but I said, yeah, I'm ethnically mixed, Pashtun Tajik, but I don't make a big deal out of it. And he said, yeah, actually, we also don't make a big deal out of it. But sometimes, if you face such consequences, like you don't even get your basic needs, you can't send your children to school, and you see people, not just Pashtuns, also other Afghans calling them, go back where you're coming from, because, their roots are not so clear. So they also have relatives in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. They came as refugees about 130 years ago to Afghanistan, and most of them are living in northern Afghanistan. So, but I think for example, also the situation in Beirut and all these places. If you talk to people on the ground, they say actually we have problems, but then our leaders they're just politicizing them, and they are making them worse. And at the same time, these the same leaders, for example, like the president himself or his circle, they don't live these realities. They just because of they have these identity problems. For example, the things that Sangha just mentioned, of the diaspora that is returning to Afghanistan. They grew up. I know some of them. I know some of their stories, at least, and they grew up in Europe with this weird identity complex: what I am, what I am not. Proud Pashtun, proud Tajik. Our ancestors did this. We have 5,000.
We was kings, bro.
5,000-year-old history, and now we have to do this and that and whatever. And and then they grew up with all this, and then they returned to Afghanistan, and they are just importing this nonsense back to the country, mixed with weird political theories they heard in the West, nationalism, of course, their ideas of secularism, and how the nation state should look like. And then they go back as the leaders. They are the educated elites, okay? And then instead of doing something constructive, they are just making things worse. And then also many educated people there, okay, many people who grew up in Afghanistan, I think have this kind of, people who studied in Kabul or in Herat or in Mazar Sharif or wherever. They also think, okay, this guy studied abroad in a known university in Germany or in the UK or in the United States. So we should look up to him because he achieved something. He has this degree. He speaks fluent English or good German, and we should take him seriously. We should learn from such people. I see many people here in the diaspora. They're just blind nationalists, idolizing, for example, Ashraf Ghani, just because he's a Pashtun and he's elites around him. And then you heard him saying things like, yeah, but these are our educated people. We have to. These are our people. They're educated. And often people who are not educated or less educated saying things like that. And then you have to describe to them that educated, a bachelor's degree or a master's degree doesn't mean that you can't be a racist idiot, okay, and a corrupt asshole.
Exactly.
That is exactly.
This is so difficult sometimes to describe this to people, and I think that a lot of these people really made a lot of damage during the last years, and often, they would never go to refugee camp in Kabul talking to average people about their lives and what kind of consequences such policies could have.
No, of course not. And I think it's also something whereby it becomes very easy being an Afghan in the West, especially as Sangar mentioned, right? Being an Afghan in the West, where you're black-haired in the Netherlands, you're Turk in the Netherlands, or black-haired, or in the UK like me, you're a Paki, it becomes very easy to become dejected about the country you come from, and the fact that no matter what, it always seems to be one step forward, 4 steps back. And I think people always go to, because Afghanistan as a nation state, we know we're sort of a nation of nations, 1747. We didn't come about, let's say, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, contrary to the views of some. But I think what happens is that in order to feel good, to get that sort of sense of euphoria, like Sangar mentioned, you have the crowds that go on and they look at these old miniatures and they read this poetry that they can't really actually understand the meaning of, and that is sort of their chauvinism. That's what they feel good about. Or they'll go back and, well, we defeated the British and we defeated the Russians and we're sort of mountain men and whatever. And I think there's also something to be said with regard to the post-2001 system. And I covered this in our podcast where we were talking about Barnett Rubin's book, reviewing it with Suzanne Schroeder. And this was what Barnett Rubin said, that Karzai was given leadership just to sort of be symbolic of Pashtun leadership. And that was because the change in government was so prominent towards one side, one political party. And I think that that sort of emphasis on representation, because the state itself is so cut off from the masses, that representation doesn't actually filter down to average citizens. So you've got this superficial, this emphasis on superficial representation, which incentivizes and even necessitates ethnic politics. The whole project was inaugurated along the lines of ethnic politics, and it's sustained by that, and that is eventually what will destroy it as well. And so after, I'm not, this isn't to say that before 2001 there was no ethnic problems. In my article on Ahmad Shah Massoud, there are sort of really racist things that some of these leaders say. And that's sort of something where the blame needs to be sort of apportioned proportionally to everyone that has engaged in it. But I think that there's sort of this sense of, wanting to feel good about something, like Sangar said, ignoring sort of the base reality, logical facts, and the fact that since 2001, the thing has become more and more ethnicized, because that's what the system creates. And so I'm going to go to the live chat. Those were my 2 cents, as they say. I'm going to go to the live chat, and we don't actually have many questions in the live chat. We've got loads of remarks.
There's some on
saying,
Twitter, I saw.
yeah, so on the live chat we've just got loads of remarks, nice things people are saying, which means I'm going to assume that people didn't ask questions because they were too busy listening to us trashing Max Blumenthal. But in any case, there's one question from Nur Ahmad Nur.
No, but come on, man. He's not Nur Ahmad Nur. He's not a communist.
Sorry,
Nur Ahmad
I
Haidar.
don't have my glasses. Nur Ahmad Haidar. My apologies. I don't have my glasses. My question
Nur Ahmad Nur was a communist
yeah.
who lives here in the Netherlands.
My question is whether these diaspora nationalists have any impact on policy of their home countries towards Afghanistan. If so, to what extent? Well, guys, do these diaspora nationalists, do they have any impact on the policy of their home country toward Afghanistan? Well, before I give the stage to Imran and to Sangar, I would say that this whole decentralization thing that's going on, this in international media, this really strong, somewhat abrupt, sudden emphasis on decentralization. Out of all of the things to focus on, by the way, this isn't to say I think decentralization is the ideal. It's what any state should be aiming towards. But I think this emphasis right now at this critical juncture does sort of have underpinnings of sort of a ethnic style of politics, and that is, there are certain people, organizations that I see that are doing that. Sangar and Imran, what do you say? Do these diaspora nationalists affect their home country's policies towards Afghanistan?
Difficult to answer, because I'm not sure what kind of connections such people have to, often, in my experience, many of these people failed in their diaspora countries, like Austria, or Austria, okay, not many Afghan Austrians, but like Germany or the UK or the US, they failed in these countries. They were not successful in these countries. So they think, let's go back to Afghanistan, and I will find an opportunity to get a position and to make some money, or to make a lot of money. And so for that reason, I'm not sure what kind of connection engaged in UK politics. So maybe there is something, you asked me and Sangar, but maybe you have the answer yourself because you're in the UK. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'll get to the UK in a bit,
Okay.
but in general, Sangar, what do you say?
So what happened after 2001 is that suddenly the attention of the entire Western Hemisphere was focused on Afghanistan. There were no translators, there were no experts, there were no cultural advisors, there were no well-organized Afghan communities in Western countries, okay? And worst of all, there were no protests by Afghans against the US invasion of Afghanistan. Okay, but let's just let that slide for now. So these countries, they realize that they are going to war to Afghanistan, but they don't know how to talk to people in Afghanistan once they send their troops there. Obviously, Jamiat Islami and all these parties who aligned with the Western countries during the invasion, people like Amrullah Saleh and Jawed Koistani and all these guys, they were the first translators for foreign forces. But then when all these embassies and NGOs, they all stormed into Afghanistan, they needed a lot of Afghans to help them. And there were a lot of Afghan diaspora, basically people who were failures in life. They just said, you know what, let's become tarjuman. And they all became tarjuman, and they went with like, I know people personally, like people who were drinking, gambling, with criminal records, people with most horrific stories, people that were a disgrace. Then suddenly these people, they became tarjuman, and they were airlifted to somewhere in Afghanistan. And after a while working with these foreign troops, they just made some money. They came back, and then before you know it, you see these guys returning back to Afghanistan and becoming involved in all sorts of organizations. But okay, everybody makes a progression. Okay, people progress, they develop. But what you often see is that here in the Netherlands, there were Afghans who started working for the Dutch Defense Department. There were Afghans who worked for the foreign ministry here in the Netherlands, just a few, okay? These people were extremely ignorant about Afghanistan. They read probably 1 or 2 books about Afghanistan written in Dutch by Dutch authors, okay? Most of these people, they couldn't even read and write in Dari and Pashto. These people, they suddenly became advisors. They worked for these governments. Similar things happened in the United States, okay? In the United States, a lot of these Afghans who grew up in Fremont and Virginia and all these places, and California, these guys, you know, most of them, they started working as consultants and advisors. They created their own entities, or they were hired by US State Department and whatnot. And they did have an impact. They did certainly have an impact on Afghanistan, because these governments relied on these people to get to know Afghanistan.
Yes.
Okay. And that's a huge problem, because see, I am now almost 40 years old, and in my life, I've read a lot of books about Afghanistan, but I have spent so many time talking to people from all different backgrounds, okay? Communists, Mujahideen, Taliban, whatever. I talked with a lot of people, discussed a lot of things, and even after all these years, I still feel like sometimes I can't really say something about Afghanistan, because I think maybe I might be wrong. But that's my attitude. You see a guy who doesn't know the difference between his left and right leg, he becomes a major advisor, researcher in international affairs on Afghanistan, and they have like a very dangerous impact on Afghanistan, because they are the eyes and ears of these Western countries.
I want to talk about someone as well. There is in London, I'm not going to mention names, by the way, but there's a communist, a very high-ranking communist, was a high-ranking communist, sort of in the government. I think he worked in propaganda. I think he was a Pachame. This guy, and I believe his wife, served as translators in Helmand. Now, naturally, he didn't speak Pashto, and his wife don't speak Pashto. But I'll just leave it sort of for everyone to really think about what kind of impact in Helmand a Dari speaking, non-Pashto speaking Parchame who is inherently prejudiced against the kind of life that people in southern Afghanistan live, what kind of impact would that have? And how would that sort of affect the general trajectory that the war took? So, Nur Ahmad Haidar, that was our answer. I would just end it by saying that we
I will
will
be back
say,
in 2 minutes.
okay, Nur Ahmad
Yeah,
Haidar,
I would just want to add something
yeah,
because, of course, when you asked the question or when Rahmat asked this question, I thought of the last 10 years. So, of course, in the early days of the war on terror, in late 2001, all these translators that were brought into the country, I didn't think of them now, but Sangar made legend points. So, of
yeah,
course, this was a huge industry, that was created back then. And I know people, family members, different kinds of people who really benefited from that and who made a lot of money
yeah.
while they really didn't care about these human consequences on the ground. They didn't care about what you just said, people in Helmand, some guy from the UK who doesn't speak Pashto, who doesn't know the area. He wasn't even interested in these people.
Who has a track record of being very bigoted against religious people, rural
Yeah, I
people, by
mean,
the
these
way. Think of
people
it.
used this momentum for their own agenda again. I think it's similar, like all these ex-communists who were recruited by the CIA to be part of the NDS, and also all
Exactly.
these other people from Jamiat, etc. For them, it was just an opportunity to continue their agenda and to fight what they saw as the enemies.
Yep. And I'd just add for Nur Ahmad Haidar, the last thing, speaking from a UK perspective, the Afghans, let's say, who are apathetic or opposed to the US invasion are not the Afghans that you generally hear about or hear from. One of the problems that Afghans have is a lack of, like we said, mentioned earlier, talking about the diaspora, is a lack of political organization or fractured political organization. And so those Afghans that would be able, that there aren't any Afghans that would be able to exert direct influence at sort of a high level on the policies of their states. Now, I've got another question, and these are the last questions. I'm going to sort of cut it here because we're getting more and more because we're
Yeah,
answering
good.
them. But there's one that says, okay, well, this is a username that's it's someone, an anonymous username, and it's saying, why does Masood have such a good reputation compared to other warlords? Do you agree with the reputation? I'll answer this very briefly, Imran, and then
Please
you
do
can
so.
answer it. And that is that the reason that I believe Masood is very good propaganda, and it's also the circumstances in which he died. It's the similar kind of thing to Dr. Najib. When generally speaking, when people die, they it sort of gains a lot of sympathy for them after their death. And do I agree with that reputation? Well, I would suggest that you go on www.afghanaye.org and you read my article, The Untold History of Ahmad Shah Massoud, where you will find out if I agree with that reputation. Imran Chimegi.
Yeah, I don't have much to add on this. I mean, I have written about this topic in the past. It was one of my first articles also in German about, warlordism in Afghanistan and people like Masood. And I think it's still important to talk about this because recently we saw France renaming a street after this man. And of course, I mean, why he was successful, or why he's portrayed very positively compared to other Mujahideen commanders and leaders is that he knew how to show himself, how to disguise himself. He was, I think, maybe you can compare it to, Kurdish groups in Syria, and especially in Syria and Turkish-Syrian border region, PKK groups who are very, who like to talk a lot with journalists, who like to portray themselves in a certain way to journalists, to push their agenda and narrative, and to, try to tie to certain things Western journalists like, so that they import these pictures to Western media outlets. And then when a Western consumer is reading that, he's like, ah, okay, they're like us. It's like, they're like us. So,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, and it's
that
also
this is,
related to what we discussed earlier with sort of these the anti-imperialist left. A lot of these organizations know exactly how to market themselves,
yes,
and they cater to that sort of market.
exactly. It's the whole PR campaign. And yeah, some people were more successful with it than others.
Okay. And sure. And I would just add, obviously, Masood's reputation, sort of a good military track record, is obviously something that is an asset in his favor. Nur Ahmad Haidar says, "I'm not a communist. I have proof of my father firing stingers on Russians." Well, uh, I
I've seen the evidence. I know he's
okay.
telling the truth.
Okay, so yes, once again, I'm sorry for the mistake, and I'm sure and I hope that you liked Imran Feiroz's article. There's one question from Suzanne Schroeder on Twitter, and this one is going to be this is a good question. Sangar, what pressure was there on Afghans in the West post 2000 post 9/11? Did they need to prove their loyalty? Who's going to take this one?
Definitely, yes. So in most Western countries, at least places I have traveled to, I've seen it. Afghans were basically invisible before 2001. Okay, we were a very small, insignificant group of minority refugees. They just saw us as all these other black and brown people from Middle East, etc. But then after 2001, everybody knew what Afghanistan is. So they would say, oh, Afghanistan, Taliban. Oh, so you are Taliban. So a lot of Afghans, they felt a lot of shame and embarrassment because they didn't want to be associated with the images that were being seen in the media of Taliban attacking women, etc. When I graduated from school here in the Netherlands, for a short while, I went to this college. I didn't finish it. I left it because it was just too stupid courses. But then, while I was in that college, there was an Afghan. I didn't know he was Afghan. Okay, he said he's Iranian. So I used to hang out with a lot of other guys in college, and they said, "Oh, he's Iranian." And I spoke to him, and I said, "You're Iranian?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Do you speak Farsi?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Where are you from?" I said, "Afghanistan." He told me in Farsi, "Don't tell these other people I'm from Afghanistan." I said, "Why?" He said, "I feel ashamed of being an Afghan." I said, "Why?" I said, "Look at the news. I don't want people to call me an Afghan." So there are a lot of people who felt like that. He wasn't just one of them. He was just one of them, but there were a lot of people who felt ashamed. Then there was also this pressure that people felt like, okay, we have to prove people that we are not Taliban. Okay, and since we are dealing with a lot of educated elitist Afghans from Kabul who have migrated to Western countries, these people, they have gone through a, how do you say, rebranding. Like you have Afghans here about 10, 12 years ago online, I had a huge discussion with Afghans who were praising Hizb Democratic Khalq Afghanistan, and they were saying, Hizb Democratic Khalq Afghanistan was a liberal party. They were liberalists, they were not communists. And this is the problem. We need to see, okay, so you're saying that the government supported by Soviet Union in the 80s was a liberal in the classical European sense of the word liberal, not the American sense of liberal. So you're saying that the Russians were supporting a classical liberal party in Afghanistan, and they said yes, and this was like a revisionism, totally a new way of telling the story, because they wanted to be seen as enlightened and educated and sophisticated and smart people. Look, we're just like you. We're not savages. We're not primitive. that this sense was very prevalent among many people. Like even until today, a lot of Afghans in Western countries, they are extremely hostile towards Afghans who dress in Afghan clothes outside. Like if I in Eid, if I go to the masjid wearing a turban and Afghan clothes, everybody's like, "Oh, mashallah, very good." You see Dutch people, they say, "Oh, very good, you look good." But you see an Afghan and they say, "You are making us feel embarrassed. Don't do this."
Yeah.
So these people, they have a very deep-rooted sense of insecurity and a shame, and that's something that is very prevalent in these countries.
Imran,
Yeah, absolutely.
Imran, did Afghans need to prove their loyalty post 2001?
Yes, I think so. I mean, you know, I've in the introduction of, of my new book, I started to describe the events of September 11 and how I witnessed them, and I think many of us witnessed them in a similar way. That you suddenly you had the society, the majority society, where you was living in, and you had to prove to them that you are with them. So people came to me. I was 9 years old, 10 years old when this happened, and people asked me about this. What do you think? Now you people will be bombed, and they forced you to show a stance and to express solidarity with them. And this also happened on the larger scale, as we discussed before. Many people in the United States, many from these Afghan diaspora people, went to Afghanistan to participate in the war somehow, and to work low level or high level. I mean, there were also many politicians and officials who started to work on a high level and to use the situation for themselves. And on the other side, you had people also in Afghanistan, but also within the diaspora, who stood up against this, who said, "No, I'm not a Talib. I have nothing to do with Al Qaeda, but I don't want you to see. I don't want to see you bombing my people, bombing my country. Your whole invasion is illegal. It is illegal, and I'm standing up against you as I stood up against the Soviets." So, and these people, some of them I know personally, faced harsh consequences because of that. While other people became rich, enjoyed the jet set lifestyle through Kabul, Dubai, Virginia, wherever,
The duality of man.
Yeah. While these people had a good life, made a lot of money, I mean, a lot of other people suffered, lived in a very poor way, or faced, different consequences, legal charges here in their diaspora countries, not because they did something bad, not because they supported terrorism or something like that, but just because they stood up against this Western aggression and the war on terror that started back then. So. Yeah, what was the actual question?
The question was, did Afghans need to prove their loyalty?
Yeah,
What pressure
exactly.
was
So many Afghans were forced to prove it, and many also proved it, and now a lot of them were like, "No, we didn't mean it like that back then." And
that's I sort of, I mean, we all, as we spoke about 9/11, the aftermath of 9/11, how it shaped us and crafted us, carved men out of it. No, I'm joking, but how it shaped us after 2001, right? Each of us in our separate experiences, but it wasn't just you had to prove your loyalty to the West. Indeed, amongst Afghans in the diaspora for a very long time, up until very recently, actually, criticizing the government in Kabul was sort of seen as something very taboo, especially, by the way, and I don't want to put an ethnic spin on this or whatever, but especially if you were a visibly Muslim Pashtun. The reason I say that is that there was very much a time where I sort of thought that the root cause of the conflict you sort of internalize the war on terror thing, and it's Islamic radicalism that's causing this and this, that, the other, without you even knowing it, because this is what you're surrounded by. But where you didn't see the occupation and the invasion as the root causes of the invasion, right? Oh, sorry, you didn't see that as the root cause of war. But I would say something like, look, this corruption, this sort of wholesale business that's going on, this is why people join the Taliban, right? And the fact that we have tens of thousands of foreign troops in Afghanistan also contributes to people joining the Taliban. And you guys have a national identity of beating the Russians, but now you've got American soldiers in your country. Now, bear in mind, I was about 14, 15 when I was raising this, but there is not an age limit to having basic logic, right? Logic is something, it doesn't respect age, class, gender, whatever. But I would, you should be careful. You're going to end up in Guantanamo. What's wrong with you? You're a Talib sympathizer. And back in these days, I used to think as a 14, 15-year-old that the Taliban had to be absolutely annihilated, right? I didn't sort of see them as, fellow countrymen of ours who are not doing the right thing or whatever. I used to think that these people need to be annihilated. But even with that, I was sort of looked at very suspiciously. So, yeah, there was a pressure after 2001, especially, I remember with the green on blue attacks, if anyone remembers them. I think there was a classmate of mine that he made a comment like, well, they wear Afghan army uniforms and they shoot American soldiers, and there are loads of Afghans in the UK as well, so I don't really know what's going to happen. Like you did hear things like that. And now I think there's one more question. Okay.
Before we do that, I have a question. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now we've discussed everything negative about Afghan diaspora. We have to also ask a very important question. If somebody claims to be an Afghan in the diaspora, somebody claims the identity and says, I am part of that nation, for that country, does that come with any responsibility? If yes, what are those responsibilities? Please.
Imran.
Yes, I think, of course, you have responsibilities if you claim to be part of something larger. And but often, you have these responsibilities, but I think that many people don't take them seriously anymore. But there's still the question: how should these responsibilities look like? For example, some people know there's responsibility and say, "Listen, I'm not an Afghan. Okay, I'm not an Afghan." People who are, for example, parts of minorities and stuff, they have also. You have also noticed that during the last years, many have distanced themselves from this identity issue.
Oh yeah.
They started to question the whole identity thing, and they started to make it more fluid and question it more. What does it mean to be Afghan? Is this word correct? Should we use? I know many people who use the term Afghanistani, who really use that as a term. So, and they
analyzing pre-modern Afghanistan from a postmodern lens. We love it, don't we?
Yeah, yes. Something like that. So they're challenging all this, and I think it's a legit question to ask. How does this responsibility look like? What do you guys think? What kind of responsibilities do you have? And I think everything you state, there will pop up a couple of people who challenge it and say, okay, but we have to deconstruct all of it, and we have to question it, and we have to start with the whole term itself. And so there's as I said, as usual, many disputes within Afghanistan.
Yeah, but the thing is that this is going to sound really blunt and really rude, but it's not really my job, my responsibility, or your and Sangar's job and responsibility to basically, placate or mollify or cuddle people who've decided that their goal in life is to be as insecure as possible about whichever identity they hold. If that's your approach, Khtaidi Malsa, I hope you find something that suits you. But in terms of the real sort of thing, moving away from the identity, I do think there is a responsibility for diaspora. I think even if sort of a white Englishman is like, we have a responsibility to help those who are, famine and in conflict and whatever, it becomes even more incumbent upon us as Afghans, especially because the Afghans that I've sort of come across are not shy about being Afghan. It's everywhere. It's on their car registration plates. It's on their belts. It's everywhere, right?
Yeah,
So
that's also
so
true. Yeah.
so the point is that if you're that proud of it, then I mean, we all have sides of the conflict currently that we don't like. We all have certain parties and political members and whatever that we don't like. I get that we all have our biases, but if we're sitting in the diaspora, I think the most important thing for us to do is to try to facilitate the way or the path for which these sides can stop fighting each other. Because if you're encouraging a war you're going to fight in, that's bad enough because it will lead to other people dying. But if you're encouraging a war, banging the drums of war, putting out jingoistic, sensationalist content that only has one purpose, and you're sort of sat there as an armchair critic, and not a hair on your body will be harmed by the war of all the consequences of your activity. That is just, as we say in Afghan, that's just beghirati. Do you know what I mean? Sat somewhere safe, encouraging, the poor Afghan soldiers, like Imran mentioned in his Dutch article with Fazl Min Allah Qazize. You're just encouraging them and the Taliban alike to die. And that is something that it actually gets me really angry, and I have absolutely no respect for anyone that does that. So I think primarily something we can all agree on is to try to facilitate the way for our people to stop fighting and dying. Would you guys agree with that?
Yes, and I would like to add the following. If you have paid attention in the last few weeks, there were two major news stories from the United States. There was one story about, again, American Afghans who defrauded the American government by taking a lot of money and recruiting people who didn't speak Dari or Pashto as translators. And these guys, they are going to be punished. If they are convicted, they will go to prison for 20 years, okay? So while Afghanistan is suffering, where there is so much pain and suffering in Afghanistan, these Afghans who have, not just in the United States, but here in the Netherlands, in other countries as well. So you live in a country where you have safety, security, education, all the resources, all the facilities, everything that you can dream of. You have it. You can do anything you want. Like, yes, there is discrimination. Yes, there is racism. Yes, I've been physically attacked several times because of who I am. It's all a reality. That's what it is in this country. But it's still 1,000 times better than living in Afghanistan. So you have to be very thankful, you have to be very grateful for the fact that you're here, and showing gratitude and showing appreciation of the fact that you are better off than your cousins in Afghanistan is by using your time, using your energy, and using your efforts, everything for something that actually benefits people and doesn't harm people. Okay, and that, in my opinion, that's the responsibility, because you claim to be an Afghan. Okay, if you're an Afghan, it means that you claim kinship with people who are still suffering, people who are still facing horrific kinds of humiliation, and like, okay, I'll tell you a very short story. There are my friends here in the Netherlands. Earlier this week, a friend of mine, he was here. They have a charity. They collect money here in the Netherlands, and they create these food packages for people, and they distribute it in places where there are a lot of people. And their guys on the ground in Kandahar, they have shot videos of how they collect food, okay, how they donate how they distribute food. And there was a video that they sent, and I was editing those videos for them. And there were videos of women in Kandahar. They were sitting on the ground with chadari, and they were begging, okay. And these people, they were distributing food packages, and there was a man and someone about like 50 years old, and he was in tears. He was crying while he got a food package. Like this man, he was in tears because he had such a desperate and horrible day that he when he saw that somebody is just giving him some food, he immediately started crying and praying, okay. When I was watching that video, I started crying as well, because it's deeply emotional. It's deeply painful to see the reality of people in Afghanistan. That's the reality of our people. And if you sit here in this country and if you have all the benefits and all the resources, and all you can do is just side with either one group or one party and create Facebook and YouTube pages insulting one group or the other group, or attacking one ethnic group or the other ethnic group, or becoming a spy for one organization or the other organization, or promoting all sorts of toxic ideas that only result into more conflict in Afghanistan, then you don't deserve to be called Afghan. You don't deserve that. You don't fulfill the minimum responsibility. And in my opinion, we should condemn such people.
I mean, if it looks like a scumbag, I mean, okay, some people don't. If it acts, thinks, and talks like a scumbag, it probably is a scumbag, right? And yeah, I think
I mean, of course, there are many groups who are just involved in the kinds of things Sangar just described. You know, many people, many groups, organizations. I think what really all these groups should, you know, at least the basic foundation we all should have is, you know, try to find a way to help the people, you know, putting political differences, etc., aside, and just, you know, if you see such things that you try to help, and that you try to help independently and build something for these people. I think that's really a responsibility we should have. But unfortunately, you know, many don't have it. And many don't have it, as far as I see. You know, in the diaspora, many people, they start to choose very different paths, and they just are focused on different disputes and quarrels and differences, and it goes on and on, and it goes on and on, and yeah, it's very unfortunate. But you know, that should be a responsibility that we all should take seriously.
Guys, that was. Should we start to wrap it up?
Yes, let's do it, because it's almost time for iftar.
There are some questions. Believe it or not, there are some questions we actually haven't answered, and that's because the nature of the questions we receive are not yes and no. They don't have yes and no answers. You could write a dissertation on each and every single one of them. Given that there are three of us, all of us naturally with our own opinions, very strong opinions, that takes quite a while. Last time the live stream took 4 hours, and I didn't anticipate it would, but because of the flurry of questions we were receiving. But in any case, to those that are watching, that was our second live stream. We had with us Emran Feroz, investigative. Welcome to the very first guest that we had on the AFGHANEYE podcast. And so Emran Feroz, his Twitter handle will be provided in the bio of this video. Sangar and I, obviously, the pair in crime. And I hope you enjoy. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. And enjoy your iftar, everyone, including you, Sangar.
Thank you very much. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. I made a small error.
I noticed.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks for having me. I really
Yes.
appreciate it.
Always welcome, Imran. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. Okay. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam.
Alaikum salam.
Welcome to the Afghan Eye YouTube channel. If this is your first visit, make sure to subscribe and press the notification bell so that you won't miss any of our new videos.